I have an interesting case study for you guys. It's going to be a little bit longer one, so please bear with me. It's the first time I'm trying this. If you guys like it, let me know in the comments, and like and subscribe, and I'll make some more case study slideshows for you. But this is a difficult one I did about a month and a half ago, and it was pretty interesting, pretty unique situation. So I hope you guys enjoy this. This is one of the, like I said, this is one of the more difficult ones I've come across in the last few years. So the vehicle's a 97 Chevy Blazer, 4.3 V6, automatic transmission, 4-wheel drive. It's new to the client, no repair history on it. The customer complaint is jerk on decel after cresting a small hill at highway speed. There's a lot of rolling hills around here. You can maintain 65, 70 miles an hour, and you're just pulling these small hills, not even downshifting, not even unlocking the torque converter. We took it out for a test drive. It does have a fishbite misfire on slight decel while keeping the torque converter locked. Very slight hesitation on tip in while accelerating from a stop. You'd almost think it was normal if you didn't know any better. It was a super slight hesitation. Enough so that the customer didn't even mention it. So these are pretty well known for horrible ignition systems. They use a flat style cap and rotor. It's really a horrible design. They have fire. They'll fire through the coil and burn the distributor cap. They'll fire through the rotor and arc right to the distributor. This one, we found an aftermarket coil. It was loose on its pole. The one mounting screw for the distributor cap was missing. The other mounting tab was broken off. These things are noted for just horrible ignition system issues. The plug wires look like they were 10 years old. So I recommended just replacing all of it. Plugs, wires, cap, rotor, distributor, and coil, all with OE quality parts. Now that's really important on this engine in particular to use an OE quality cap and rotor. The client was referred to me by another professional, so we referred him back for the repair work. So I think I'm done with this car. More than likely it was something to do with that system. I wouldn't expect to see it again. 2 weeks later, all the repairs got performed as suggested. The symptom's still there, absolutely no change whatsoever. Verified the symptom with the client. Sure is, still there, didn't change a bit. Well, at least the maintenance got done, so we can kind of rule that out. Now, it's time to really dig in and see what we got going on. So, where do you start with something like this? There's no codes. Already verified that the misfire counts. It does count misfires on seemingly random cylinders during the misfire event. It really only feels like a single misfire, but and it's really quick. It's just a quick fish bite misfire and then back to normal. Every time I take this vehicle out to recreate the event, I'm out for at least 20 minutes. It's pretty difficult to get it to happen. Maybe once in every 3 attempts, I get it to work, get it to fail, and get the misfire event to happen. So, this is a fairly simple system. It's port fuel injection. The PCM controls ignition timing, so there's no vacuum advance or weights in the distributor or anything like that to worry about. It's an overhead valve, so no cam followers, nothing crazy like that, just a push rod, rocker style, real simple V6. It does have a crank position sensor. The cam position sensor is inside the distributor. It does use a knock sensor to retard the timing in the event of a knock event or pre-ignition. The PCM monitors the cam and crank correlation via the cam retard PID. So we test drove it while data logging all appropriate PIDs. No problems. Nothing found. Everything looks absolutely normal. I'd ask you if you had any questions, but you wouldn't answer me anyway. So I'm not even sure that I really do have a misfire, but I'm going to take the time to prove it. So we hooked onto the crank position sensor signal wire with the scope. That's the blue trace in the lower left-hand corner. And then set the scope up to graph the frequency of the crank position sensor signal so I can ID a misfire if it happened. And that's what that little squiggle is in the upper left-hand corner, is the misfire event happening. So you can see the service information is a little bit vague on where the signal is. So the signal ended up being on the yellow wire, which is the high reference on the OE diagram. But I'll elaborate here on the next slide that the service info is wrong. The stuff from Mitchell's ProDemand is in the lower left-hand corner. It shows both the crankshaft position sensor and the camshaft position sensor as the same sensors, same type of sensor. They're not. They're both digital sensors, but they create the square wave in two unique ways. You can see the actual design of the sensors in the upper left-hand corner. That's the OE diagram. So it's important to understand what you're doing and what you're working on, and sometimes you may have to dig for an OE diagram or, scope all three wires and then determine what you're dealing with, which takes a fair bit of knowledge and skill, but it's worth developing if you're going to take on problems like this. The little details can really slow you down. You could easily waste a few hours trying to figure out what the heck you're doing here if you don't know and you don't understand what you're looking at. So the cam position sensor actually creates a square wave to ignition voltage, and the crank position shaft sensor creates a 5-volt square wave. So it's important to understand the difference. And here you can see the yellow trace is the cam position sensor, the blue trace is the crankshaft position sensor, the red trace is the number 1 cylinder firing, and the green trace is the crankshaft position, speed, in frequency. So that would let you know if you had any frequency variations or speed variations on the crankshaft sensor. Another weird thing I found in the service information was it said that we had a 4x signal for the crankshaft sensor. And on the scope, you can see that we have a 3-time sensor, which means there's 3 pulses per revolution. So that could throw you off and waste a bunch of time. But really all they did was copy and paste the crankshaft sensor information from the V8, which does have 4 pulses per rotation. But because this is a 6-cylinder, we have 3. So on to the next page. So I went down a rabbit hole with the cam sensor. I had 1.27 volts loss at the ignition fuse that feeds the cam sensor circuit. So while monitoring that, I noticed the voltage was pretty low. So that's a problem. I didn't know if it was the problem, but I wanted to make sure it wasn't the problem. I didn't want to overlook it. So with it running, we ran a jumper wire right from the battery to that feed at the sensor. And you can see the increase in voltage in the square wave. We took it out, we test drove it, recreated the issue. You can see the misfire in the lower right-hand corner on the green line, the squiggle. And the voltage is normal at the cam sensor, so we know that isn't the issue. So time to move on. So we went to looking at fuel injection to see if we were losing a fuel injector during that event. And I found a pretty unique situation. So I would see it double fire the injectors at one point, and then anytime I got a missed pulse, I would get the misfire. The missed pulse didn't make any sense because it was happening at about a little over 400 degrees of rotation, which really doesn't track with anything that makes logical sense. So I know what's causing the problem. So that every time I see that missed pulse, I have a misfire with the torque converter locked in overdrive just before I enter coasting mode. I still don't have a good reason why. I'm a little concerned, a little confused. So I want to check grounds and make sure we don't have a weird issue on the PCM grounds. So I went ahead and did that, and you can see the voltage drop on the ground is going to be a direct representation of the current flowing through that circuit. Now, depending on the resistance from the PCM ground to the battery ground, that may or may not be a problem. Here you can see when it double fires that injector, or all of the injectors, that we see increased voltage drop on the ground, but it's still not even 50 millivolts. It's still like 24 millivolts. It's insignificant. But here you can see a representation of the current flowing through the PCM and through that ground during operation. Kind of neat, but didn't really give us much insight. So I still have no idea why I have the double pulse or the missed pulse. All of the data collected so far shows no reason for this weird situation. The customer did have a known good PCM, so we swapped that out, and the symptoms are exactly the same with the other PCM. So again, I don't know. I'm kind of at a loss here, a little concerned about my ability. So, roadblocks suck, now what? I've reached a dead end with no answer, but I have one other symptom I've ignored until now. The slight hesitation while accelerating from a stop just became worthy of investigation. The fuel trims were less than 5% total with normal O2 switching. That's normal to me, especially on a 20-some-year-old vehicle. I would say anything less than 5% O2s are switching normally. I'm not concerned with fuel control in the least. All the inputs look good on the live data, and because, even on modern vehicles, live data doesn't have a fast enough refresh rate to catch glitches and weird stuff. So spent a lot of time monitoring the inputs with a scope while looking for the problem, and nothing. I did achieve a backfire through the intake on a snap throttle, but that's not just stabbing my foot to the floor. That's actually grabbing a hold of the throttle lever where the cable attaches on the throttle body and snapping it open as fast as I could. Then I did get a backfire. So that tells me that I'm lean on tip-in or lean on snap throttle if I'm getting a backfire through the intake on snap throttle like that. So now I feel silly because I didn't check fuel pressure and volume. I probably should have. Well, checked it. It's fine. So that checks out good. Now I'm really concerned. What is left? So I'm going to do some more scoping since I have everything out. Blue is the number 5 secondary after the distributor cap. You can see the voltage looks kind of low on the secondary. That's not uncommon on a distributor system, so don't let that fool you that much. The red is the number 5 at the coil secondary wire. You can see that looks a lot more normal. That's probably something that you'd expect to see. And anytime I have any question with these, I'll actually pop the spark plug wire off the spark plug, pop a spark tester in there, and check it with a spark tester. You get really good, if you use the same spark tester every time, you get really good at checking these systems out with the spark tester and analyzing the secondary ignition to determine the health of your coil and the rest of your system. So in the lower left-hand corner, you can see what it looks like with the spark tester on there. Much shorter burn line because we're just firing it into midair. But we're firing it to ground across the spark tester. But that's normal operation. You can see the firing voltage is much higher. So I know the system is capable of much higher firing voltages than I'm seeing with the secondary. So that's all normal. Everything looks great. Onto the pulse sensor at the intake. At idle, we had some variation, but the valves seem to be sealing. It's relatively smooth. There's subtle variances, but nothing really jumping out at me, and not enough variance to really make me concerned. Now, with the engine running, there's a lot of variables. I like to do cranking tests, so we disabled the fuel injection system, did intake pulse cranking, nice and even. Exhaust pulse cranking, also nice and even. So what that tells me is the mechanical state of the engine, the valves are sealing normal, and the mechanical state of the engine is good. So I know that I'm not dealing with a weird mechanical issue. So again, I'm kind of at a loss. I'm done with the scope, a little frustrated. So back to the basics. What's going to make those intake pulses vary? Valves, maybe, but no misfire and a smooth idle? Pretty unlikely. It has plenty of power at wide open throttle, so we know we're not lean at wide open throttle. We know we have a lean condition on snap throttle, and I know my limitations. I don't spend a lot of time messing around with pulse sensors on the scope, so I don't have enough experience or confidence to determine the problem looking at an idle pulse sensor waveform. I know there's a variance there, but I'm not confident enough by looking at that waveform to make any sense of it. But I do have a vacuum gauge that I've used for about 20 years and have tons of confidence in my ability to look at that and make a determination. I already hooked it up at the beginning of this job and didn't see any issues whatsoever. This time I hooked it up and things were clearly different. I could see the needle was unstable, and now I have a clue. Learning how to read a vacuum gauge is way worth your time. Sometimes you just have to connect the dots. For lean on snap throttle, we have unsteady intake vacuum at idle. The valves are sealing reasonably well, verified with the pulse sensor cranking. I suspect poor fuel control, but the fuel trims are fine. Maybe poor atomization? So let's take a look. We stuck the borescope. After letting it cool down, we put the borescope down the throttle body, and I can see there's wetness in the intake, and there's a couple of clean intake runners, which doesn't make any sense because this has port fuel injection, so the injectors spray right on the backside of the intake valves. There's no reason fuel should be this high. So that's a concern, and the clean intake runners, it also tells me there's a problem there. The carbon buildup's fairly normal. This has EGR that dumps right into the middle of the intake, so I expect that carbon to be there. But the clean runners were concerning. So with the caveman tools, scopes are awesome. I use one every day, all day, some days, but there's probably not a day that goes by in the shop I don't have the scope out for some reason. So the scope, I don't want to sell that short at all. It helped me prove a lot in this case, but it didn't give me the answers I was looking for. In this case, what we needed was a slow measurement, like a vacuum gauge. The borescope and the the borescope captures and the unsteady intake vacuum at idle was the key. This indicated poor fuel control or poor atomization, but the fuel trims are okay, so we know we're getting the expected amount of fuel through this engine. The engine's inhaling that the correct amount of fuel and exhaling it through the exhaust, and the O2 sensors recognize this. So we must have an issue with at least one or more of the fuel injectors. At this point, I determined it is worthy of teardown and inspection, so I present my findings to the client. They agree to go ahead with the teardown, and everything looks fine. These are the newer style injectors. They don't have poppet valves on the end, so they spray normally. Everything looks normal. Now what? So finally, we have a solution. After a visual inspection and teardown revealed nothing obvious, I decided to test the spray pattern of each injector, hoping to find one spraying poorly or dripping fuel instead of spraying, something like that. And bingo. Number 2 looked great. Moved on to number 4. When I fired the injector number 4, number 6 fired instead. So I double checked my wiring diagram. Sure enough, 4 and 6 were swapped. Somebody had installed this at one time and put injector 4 in the number 6 hole and injector number 6 in the number 4 hole. With a little more looking, 1 and 3 were also swapped. So now all my confidence is shot. I'm not even sure I'm going to fix it like this, but I know this is the only problem I was actually able to find on this thing. So we swapped everything back. And while checking over our wiring diagrams, we noticed that GM knew the potential to mess this up and made it pretty easy to do it right. All the control wires for the injectors are the same as the engine bank layout. 135 on the driver's side, 246 on the passenger side. The pins in the injector fuel distribution block assembly, all the pins match the cylinder bank layout. If you look at the bottom, all the wires come out the bottom in a way that matches the cylinder bank layout. So this is really difficult to mess up. But they can't all be easy. Solving riddles all day can and should be profitable. This situation could have been as much a headache as the vehicle. Typically, the most difficult part of a problem vehicle is the client. You do not let this be a problem. It's important to set the client's expectations properly. I have strict but reasonable rules for client behavior in these situations. If a client doesn't follow the rules, we don't do business. You have to know when to bail. Not every car can be fixed for a profit. So, if you continue after accepting the fact that this vehicle isn't going to make you a profit, you need to learn everything you can from this experience. And that's why we're here. That's why I'm making this to share with you guys, because I want somebody else to be able to profit off of this expensive endeavor. You know, this wasn't a profitable job. It was nice that we got it fixed, we got the customer taken care of, but I knew after the first few hours that this wasn't going to be a profitable job. Now, the customer still paid a reasonable amount to have this fixed. I'm sure from their perspective, they feel like they paid more than enough. But knowing I have probably about 18 hours into this thing, I definitely didn't charge 18 hours of shop time to work on this. So it's important that if you're going to take on these difficult problems, that you set everybody's expectations and set yours as well. And if you expect to make money on a difficult problem, you better make sure the customer's on board, or you're just going to have a rough time, and it's going to be a rough week. So, bonus slide is the confirmed fix. Here you can see the double pulses and the missed pulse, and the green line across the bottom of the screen is the crankshaft frequency and no misfire. What we did determine was that double pulse and the missed pulse are actually the fuel trim strategy. So instead of altering the pulse width of the injectors, it actually uses a multi-port strategy to add fuel when the O2s indicate lean in closed loop as a one single shot with all the injectors. And then if it indicates rich, it actually shuts all the injectors off for about 400 degrees. So that what you're actually seeing is on the missed pulse or the double pulses is actually in closed loop. That's the fuel trimming positive and then negative, adding fuel and subtracting. So that's the end of this case. I appreciate you watching. If you watched it this far, if you guys like this kind of content, let me know, like and subscribe, and I will make more and demonstrate more ways of working through my process and what it takes to get these cars fixed. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. Have a great day.